Welcome to the distance learning program presented by Innobus on JAS, that is Java Authentication Authorization Services. Have you ever needed to create a login authentication mechanism for an application? You might have, and probably more than once, with each new implementation being close but not identical to the previous one. For example, one implementation might use Oracle database, another might use an NT authentication, and another a LDAP, which is nothing but lightweight access directory protocol directory. So therefore, it would have been nice to support all these security mechanisms without changing any application level code. And this is the introduction for authentication and authorization. It's all about Java applications getting secured using authentication and authorization services. So let's see the course introduction. The Java Authentication and Authorization Service was introduced as an optional package to the Java 2 SDK, which is standard edition of 1.3. JAS was integrated into J2 SDK 1.4. Java Authentication and Authorization Services suggest it provides a framework and an API for the authentication and authorization of users, whether they are human or automated processes. JAS implements a Java version of the standard pluggable authentication module framework. JAS authentication is performed in a pluggable fashion. This permits application to remain independent from underlying authentication technologies. JAS can be used for two purposes: authentication and authorization. Once the user or service executing the code has been authenticated, the JAS authorization component works in conjunction with the core Java 2 access control model to protect access to sensitive resources. The invention of JAS reflects Java's evolution into a general-purpose programming language used for implementing traditional client and server applications that require login and access control. JAS protects the system from users by allowing or denying access based upon who or what runs the program. So let's see the JAS architecture. This architecture is based on J2EE container, that is Java Enterprise Edition, within which we use web application which runs in J2EE container and using JAS framework for authentication and authorization services. So therefore, enterprise identity assets can be LDAP, many more for servicing these, and underlying base will be provided by JAS framework. There will be certain Java policies for authorization techniques which involves policy engine, and this is the basic JAS architecture found in J2EE container. It can also be used for Java applications. And here this architecture or framework, it involves many components or classes or interfaces to provide authentication and authorization services. So end user, he requires credentials and JAS will use login context. JAS configuration is done once you have login context, within which you have login module. And finally, for login results, you have JAS subject, JAS principal, JAS credentials. So all these are the classes and interfaces used in JAS. We will be seeing JAS API to see in more detail these components. So basically, if you see diagram, you can see JAS framework having all these components involved in it. So let's see the JAS API. As said, all these components clubbed together will give you JAS API within the framework where you have login module. It is from the package javax.security.auth.spi.login module. The login modules are written by implementing this interface. They contain the actual code for authentication. It can use various mechanisms to authenticate user credentials. The code would retrieve a password from a database and compare it to the password supplied to the module. It could also use a flat file, LDAP, or any other means of storing user information for that purpose. So generally, in enterprise networks, all authentication credentials are stored in one place, which might be accessed through LDAP, that is Lightweight Data Access Protocol. Next is the login context present in javaxsecurity.auth.login.login context, which is the core of JAS framework, which kicks off the authentication process by creating a subject. As the authentication process proceeds, the subject is populated with various principals and credentials for the further processing. Then we have subject, which is again found in javaxsecurity.auth package. A subject represents a single user, entity, or system. In other words, a client requesting authentication. This is known as subject. And there is a principal coming from Java Security Principal package. A principal represents the face of an object. It encapsulates the features or properties of an object. An object can contain multiple principals. Then finally, we have credentials present or can use these below packages, that is javaxsecurity.auth.destroyable and javax.security.auth.refreshable. So credentials are nothing but pieces of information regarding the subject in consideration. They might be account numbers, passwords, certificates, etc. As the credential represents some important information, the further interfaces might be useful for creating a proper and secure credential, like these packages can be useful for getting the credential mechanism. Suppose that after the successful authentication of the user, you populate the subject with a secret ID with which the subject can execute some critical services, but the credential should be removed after a specific time. In that case, one might want to implement destroyable interface. Refreshable might be useful if a credential has only a limited time span in which it is valid. So these are the JAS APIs, important APIs. Let's see some of the concepts which must be known, can be called as fundamental concepts or generic terms which are necessary to be known when we are working with Java authentication and authorization services. So to begin with, permission. A permission is a named right to perform some action on a target. For example, one permission might be all classes in the package. For example, com.myapp can open sockets to the internet addresses. Internet address could be myapp.com. Who is granted a permission? Some entity is granted a permission. In Java, this entity is usually either a user or a code base. Credentials. Credentials can take many forms other than a username and passwords. A single credential like your password for a voicemail system. A physical credential like a garage door opener to open your garage. A digital certificate. A mix of physical and key-in credentials like your ATM card and your PIN number. Biometric credentials like your thumbprint or retinal scan, which can be used for biometric credential in many of the applications which are very sensitive and important. Involving permission, there are types of permission applied. Can be profile permission, having read, write, and document permission, and also document permission all which as programming group. So the actions can be read, write. Policies. Policies map the entities that might attempt to access the resources to their permission. In the Java security framework, a policy is represented by subclasses of the abstract class java.security.policy. So this class is always a singleton. It means only one instance will be provided for every Java virtual machine. So this is the permission. If you consider for an example, you want to give a permission for a respective text file called cheese. In this diagram or this pictorial, you can see there is a text file called cheese and you want to grant a permission to write a file into this text. And how will you give that? You have to have a grant as a name or a word where declaration of an individual grant clause, because this grant does not put specify who or what is being given the permission. It just applies to all. So after grant, you're starting with permission. This is a permission grant entry. Following is the class representation, which will be the Java IO file permission. And what is the permission? The target to be granted the permission will be the source file, that is text file. Finally, the actions to be taken on this text file, and that is write. So this is how you generally grant a permission for specific resource. In Java authentication and authorization services, next we will see the authentication. Authentication is the process of verifying the identity of users. So authentication of users to reliably and securely determine who is currently executing the Java code, regardless of whether the code is running as an application, an applet, a bean, or a servlet. So basically, authentication is the process of verifying the identity of the users. So it can be done using a user prompt asking for login. Any application over network or any desktop application, enterprise level application will involve this authentication prompting for user ID and password. And that is where authentication service starts by verifying the identity of users. To authenticate a subject, which we have seen it can be a user or a service, the following steps are performed. An application instantiates a login context. The login context concerns a configuration to load all of the login modules configured for that application. The application invokes the login context login method. The login method invokes all of the loaded login modules. Each login module attempts to authenticate the subject. Upon success, login modules associate relevant principals and credentials with the subject object that represents the subject being authenticated. The login context returns the authentication status to the application. If the authentication succeeded, the application retrieves the subject from the login context. So these are the steps which should be involved when you are creating any kind of authentication service. Let's see the life cycle of authentication. So basically, while Java x.security.auth will provide a login context interface contains only three methods. The life cycle it goes through authenticate a subject. So it's quite complex. The login context is first created with two items. An application name it will be authenticating subjects after which it wants to authenticate. So here if you see a client code which uses login context and the configuration setting should be done for specific application name using the method get app configuration entry, which in turn uses login method, after which login method will test for each login module, initialize and also login, and once authentication is successful it will commit, or if it was failed it will abort, and finally it will return the subject back. So this is the login module lifecycle. So here the login module implements default constructor. It is used to create a new instance of login module. Because of the default no argument constructor, another method is used to pass the method object. This is done with the lpop initialize method, which takes the subject to the authenticated, the callback handler to use to gather credentials, a map used as a sessions shared by all the login modules in use, and a map of configuration options specified by the configuration. When the login context executes a login module's login method, the login module does whatever is needed to authenticate the subject. This is the first phase of the two-phase process. If the login attempt succeeds, true to be written. If it is failed, a login exception is thrown, which is from java.security.auth. So here, login module is required to be successful as the succeeded, and also the controller commit will be performed. If it is not, abort is performed. The next is authorization. Authorization is the process of enforcing access restrictions upon those authenticated users. So once you have authenticated by prompting user ID and password, later on the process of authorization will start by checking the restrictions for respective roles of that user identity. JAS authorization extends the existing Java security architecture that uses a security policy to specify what access rights are granted to executing code. Permissions can be granted based not just on what code is running but also on who is running it. Permissions can be granted in the policy to specific principles. How is JAS authorization performed? To make JAS authorization take place, the following are required. The user must be authenticated. Principal-based entries must be configured in the security policy. The subject, that is the result of the authentication, must be associated with the current access control context. So this was the complete picture of Java authentication and authorization services. Let's see the demo on Java authentication and authorization service. But before that, we need to see the configuration done for Java authentication and authorization service. So here you have a concepts like required. This module must authenticate the user, but if the user fails, the authentication nonetheless continues with the other login modules in the list, if any. Requisite. If the login fails, then the control returns back to the application and no other login modules will execute. Sufficient. If the login succeeds, then the overall login succeeds and control returns to the application. If the login fails, then it continues to execute the other login modules in the list. Optional. The authentication process continues down the list of login module irrespective of the success of this module. So these are the configuration details to be known in JAS. So let's see the demo on JAS. This is the pictorial representation of the demonstration which we are going to see now, and always the authentication entry will start from login context, which will have login method in it, and also we are going to use this login context to get login method. Finally, it also gives methods like get subject to as privileged and logout. And the login context will also use the login.config file. The config file name can be anything, but it uses the config file, which is also required for your demonstration. And also, there are login module. The login module will also be used in our demonstration. So it has got lifecycle methods, which we have already seen in our course. It has got initialize, login, commit, abort, and logout. And there are name back, that is name callback, and password callback used from callback handlers for verifying the name and password. So therefore, this is the basic structure where you can have the authentication performed using the login context, login module, and then the callback handler. So we will see all this put together in our demonstration. So there are configuration file required, that is .config file as well as .policy file. These files are required for applying permission as well as login credentials. Let's see the demonstration on JAS. So before that, we need certain config files. There is a drive, C drive, within which I have created a folder called JAS example. So here in this directory or folder, there should be a configuration file, can name anything, but it should end with .config. So here if you see the content here, there is a name for this configuration within which we are giving the JAS configuration detail that is required. So that required is applied on this Java class. This is a Java class present within this package. So therefore, we are giving a JAS configuration module called required, which will be applied to this login module Java class. So here the name of the config to be applied is login. So this is the config file which has to be present within this folder. So you have one more folder called policy config to apply permission, which will come in authorization. So therefore, in this if you see, you have a property permission coming from Java util. We have already seen the syntax of this where you have grant. Let me increase the font size. So here you have the syntax grant and within which permission, and this is the source which we have seen. Here we are doing a property permission which is from Java util, and this is the user which will be given the permission as read, and therefore for password also there is a permission read, and for the file that is java security auth.login.config, the permission is read, as well as java.security.policy permission is read. these permissions are given along with there is an auth permission used from the package javax.security.auth, that auth permission within which we are creating the login context dot login, and this is the login which is the name given to the config file within the config file. So now these two files are required for this demonstration, which we are demonstrating the JAS, that is Java Authentication and Authorization. Once these are placed within the folder, this is a package structure, that is com inobus.auth, and within this these three files are required for this demonstration. So let's see the callback handler. So this is the Java class which is used. Here the callback handler are implemented in an application dependent fashion. For example, an application implements a callback handler and passes it to underlying security services so that they may interact with the application to retrieve specific authentication data such as usernames and passwords, or to display certain information such as error and warning messages. So therefore these call handlers are implemented in this demonstration. So here we have a callback handler interface being implemented within our custom class, and also the callback handler implementation decides how to retrieve and display information depending on a callback's passed to it. So for example, if the underlying service needs a username and password to authenticate a user, it uses name callback and password callback. So the callback handler can then choose to prompt for a username and password serially, or to prompt for both in a single window. So here a default callback handler class implementation may be specified in auth.login.default call handler, and therefore the security property can be set in Java security properties file located in the Java home, where the JDK will be installed, within which we will have JRE runtime, and the lib folder you can find security folder within which there will be a java.security. This was all about call handler interface. So here in this demonstration we have implemented using this interface and also trying to authenticate the username and password. So within this, the constructor will be taking the username and password, which we will pass through the command line, and once it is passed, we will set the username with the supplied callback and also the password. This is to take the username and set it for the supplied, that is callback array. And once this username and password are set, the next step is, let's see, login module class. So in this login module class, we have the authentication done using login module. So we have also seen the login module lifecycle in this training. So here we use the subject. We have also seen what is called a subject and the callback handler. So if it is successful, it will be commit. If it is failed, it will be abort. And once it is initialized, the lifecycle method will start by initializing subject and callback handler. So using the login method, which is there in login module, we will be performing by verifying the username and password. So here we will be checking the scenario will be if we give the username and password as same, then it will be authentication. This is just a scenario where you are testing it. You can have your own username and password, but in our test we'll keep both the username and password as same, and here we are checking if it is equal, then it is authenticated, and if it is not equal, it will be login failed. So this is how we do the authentication. So here we have already seen the callbacks we get is username and password, for which we use name callback and password callback, and this will be initiated within this array, and finally we'll check that, verify if we have got proper password and name, and respectively the exception will be thrown if it is not supported. The next class is to test this authentication. So how to test the authentication? We are going to use login context. Login exception is used for catching exception. The main thing to test is login context. We have also seen the concept of this. So here we have a main class within which the username and password is set. It is user and password, and the callback handler class. This is the custom class by which you are passing the username and password. And finally, using the login context constructor, which takes login, this is the config detail and the handler. And using this login context.login, it will give the respective result. So login method is used from the login context, and this will authenticate the user if we pass user ID and password accordingly. So status will be based on success and failure. If it is success, it will be true and it will commit giving successful login. And if it is failure, it will be login failed. So once you have these three classes defined in the folder structure format, which you can follow with the package and place these Java files. One is callback handler, then login module within which we use the login lifecycle methods. There are login method, commit method, and abort method, initialize method. So these are the life cycles of login module. For this, there should be a class handled in it, and once this is done, we try to test using login context using login method. So as told earlier, we need to add the config file as well as policy config file within this folder. So the root folder should have these two files be present. Once it is done, we should compile all the Java classes and then zip it to get the jar file, which will be executable jar file. And here we have named it as jas-example.jar. So using this, we will try to authenticate the user as well as authorize the permission for the user. So you have to get the executable jar out of the .class files for the three Java files which we have created. So I have used a build.xml to create the jar file. So you can also check the build.xml. So this is a sample of build.xml. To create the jar file, you can just put it by compiling the source files and then place it in examples name, which we are calling as jas-example.jar. So this will place the jar file along with your compiled classes and the scenarios. So let's see the scenarios to test this example. So using this build file and command, you can generate this jar file. So the jar file is nothing but executable jar adding all the .class files of these three Java classes which we just now saw. Now let's execute the program with different scenarios. So let's see the scenario 1. So this is the scenario which will verify if the user name and password are equal, because our first scenario is to check the user credential is authenticated or not. For that, it takes the password what we pass and user ID is passed. In our business logic Java code what we have written, if these two are equal, then only it is authenticated and it is successful. So we are going to pass an hard-coded value which will be Jeff as user ID and password as Jeff. It should be same, then it will be successful. So you have to run these commands, that is java-d user equal to Jeff, and also the password value, and all these commands should be in a single line. So finally, java.security.auth.login.config is the config file which we have given here, and this is the config file which I was talking about, which we have defined as a login, applied for login module class, and then the jar which has been clubbed with all three Java classes. So let's execute this. Locate the path wherever the directory or the folder we have placed all the config and policy detail along with the source folder and executable jar generated using three jar Java class files. So here, let's see the first scenario. So this is the first scenario just now we have seen. You need to have user as Jeff, password as also Jeff to get your login successful, which shows it has been authenticated user along with the auth login.config, which we are passing as jazz config, here JASS jazz config, along with the executable jar file. And once you execute this, you can see here the login successful. So it means we are verified within the business logic code where we are checking if the user ID and passwords are same. And also you remember the business logic can depend on your requirement. You can test based on your scenario. You can verify with the name and password stored in the database and also verify by getting appropriate name and password which gets from different servers. So here in order to show simple demonstration we have hard coded with user and password and then comparing if these two are same then only we are trying to authenticate, and this is the first scenario. So let's see the next scenario. So here next scenario says that you are giving the user as Jeff whereas password as wrong password. You're not giving the same name as username, instead you're giving a wrong name. Here we are just giving for an example not Jeff. You can give anything. It should be other than username. So here if there is a mismatch then you will be throwing an error as failed. So along with this you also need to give the security.auth.login config, which in our case it is a jazz.config, and finally we also have the executable jar. So let's execute these commands. So this is the second scenario. If you see the user is Jeff and the password is not Jeff, you can give any name, you can change here. So within the command prompt you can change this name as Jeff or Jeff D, anything you want. So we have changed it, and yeah. So this is the second scenario. Let's execute this, and did you see this? It is telling login failed. The reason being the user ID is Jeff whereas it is not matching with the password, and our condition was if both the user ID and the password are same then only you will be authenticated. So here it is not same, in fact these are different, so therefore user ID and password will be mismatched and you're not authenticated. Login has been failed. This is the second scenario. Let's see the third scenario. In this scenario it says that you have same user ID and same password, but here we are checking mainly for the security manager. So here we have to see by giving no policies and check whether the permission will be granted. So in order to check by not giving any specific policy, let's see will this succeed. So here the result should be failed because there is no such policies defining the respective permission to be granted on this jar example.jar file. So therefore it has to throw an exception. So let's see that and execute the third scenario. Yeah, this is the third scenario. So if you see, it has thrown an exception telling access control exception access denied because the policy for applying specific permission has not been specified. So this shows the authentication is successful whereas authorization is not, because even though the user ID and password are matching, it has been succeeded, but the permission is the authorization. There is no permission for you to access the jar file, that is jars-example.jar. Therefore, it is throwing an exception. So let's see how to see the service for authorization. That will be the next scenario. Scenario 4. So here, if you see, the other commands remain same. We are giving user ID and password as same so that we get authenticated. And next is the config file which is required to apply on login module Java class. And finally, the policy which gives the permissions to be applied. And we have this policy.config file, and if you recall, we have given as read. So therefore, there will be applied permission on this and it will be successful. So let's see and execute that scenario. And this is that scenario. If you see, it is telling login successful. And this is how you can achieve the Java authentication and authorization services. And this was a simple demonstration by using the APIs provided by Jazz and also the configuration details provided by Jazz. And these are the commands which can be executed by the JDKs which are built in. The Jazz features are there within your JDK. And we are done with this. And this was the end of the session. Thank you.